You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Satu Lemay. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center, and I also direct the East-West Center in Washington. Delighted to have you this morning or this evening in the case of one of our speakers, but also some of you joining us online at different times and different places. We welcome you all to this program as part of our webinar series with the General Accounting Office, GAO, on protecting national security at U.S. universities while maintaining international collaboration. As many of you who are joining our program today are well aware, a number of issues are threading together and swirling together on issues related to exchange of higher education, protecting national security interests, technology. Sometimes this is called economic statecraft and implicates a number of issues. And we are very fortunate indeed to have 4 experts from the General Accounting Office, as well as Dr. Sunghong Lee, Director of the China Center at Sejong Institute, to discuss how these issues play, particularly based on a study of GAO in the United States, where they looked at US universities and how they are protecting national security and complying with export controls and related issues, while having foreign students in our universities. As many of you know, about 65% of international students at US universities come from the Asia-Pacific region. We estimate in our Asia Matters for America project by state and by congressional district the economic implications of such exchange. But there are also national security issues, as I said, at play, and their study looks at how a select group of universities is dealing with this. Dr. Lee will speak to the issue of how Korea sees this as part of its own ongoing relations at its fine universities in Korea. So you have the bios of all the speakers, and I'm not going to read them except to say that they are breadth of expertise on China, international relations, public policy, economics, and they will bring their expertise to bear over the next 30 or 40 minutes, and then we will open it up for Q&A. We're going to be led off by the Director of the International Trade Issues, International Affairs and Trade Team at U.S. General Accounting Office, Ms. Kimberly Giannopoulos, and then she will be followed by her team, Mr. Lindsay, Ms. Bartine, and Ms. Bright, who will present the findings of their report, and then we will ask Mr. Lee, Dr. Lee to make some comments. With that, welcome to all of you. Welcome to our participants. And Ms. Giannopoulos, may I request that you make your opening comments?
Thank you, Satu, for inviting us to speak today in our recent work regarding U.S. universities' implementation of export control laws and regulations. As we'll discuss in some detail, there's a great deal of concern about universities' ability to safeguard sensitive technologies from foreign students and scholars. The news cycle is full of stories of economic espionage, including arrests of foreign scientists at airports carrying vials of biological specimens, or reporting about foreign attempts to hack US COVID research. Some of the recent reporting is reminiscent of spy thrillers, complete with suspects dumping computer hard drives or hiding out in foreign embassies. But what we have to talk about today are real stories and real attempts to circumvent US laws, including export control laws. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to discuss selected aspects of our recent work, including some background information explaining the nature of the issue and our recommendations to the US government agencies. But before we do, we thought it would be helpful to tell you just a little bit about who we are and how we do our work. Next slide, please. First of all, what is GAO? The Government Accountability Office is an independent, nonpartisan legislative branch agency. Members of Congress can request that GAO review a specific issue, or Congress can include mandates for GAO to review specific issues in laws. GAO also conducts a very small portion of its work on its own accord. We support Congress in meeting its constitutional oversight responsibilities and help improve the performance and ensure the accountability of the federal government. GAO publishes reports, legal decisions, and appears for congressional testimonies, among other things, to fulfill our duties to Congress and the American people. Next slide, please. GAO has 15 mission teams that cover a wide range of topics, programs, and agencies across the federal government. Basically, wherever the federal dollar goes, we go. Our team within GAO, the International Affairs and Trade Team, leads GAO's work in support of congressional oversight of efforts to advance and protect U.S. foreign policy and international economic interests in a complex and challenging global environment. My portfolio of work focuses on a wide variety of international trade issues, such as sanctions, export controls, tariffs, and customs enforcement. Next slide, please. The report we're discussing today, which was issued this past May, was jointly requested by Senators Charles Grassley and John Cornyn and Representative Ralph Norman. They sent us a request letter that covered a broad range of topics related to export control laws and safeguarding sensitive technologies from foreign threats. Because of the long list of issues included in the letter, we opted to complete this work in 2 phases. The first phase, which we'll be discussing today, focused on the guidance that federal agencies provide to U.S. universities to support their efforts to implement export control regulations, and the actions that a select group of universities have taken to safeguard their sensitive technologies and implement these regulations. We recently started the second phase of this work, which is focused on the enforcement of export controls at U.S. universities. Now I'll turn it over to Drew to provide some context for our recent work. Drew?
Thank you, Kim. As Kim and Satu alluded, the main issue underlying our work is the challenge inherent in trying to effectively balance the benefits associated with the contributions made by foreign students and scholars with the threat that they may acquire controlled information and use it to promote economic and military advances in their home countries, some of which may be US adversaries. So first, let me talk about the benefits. The United States experienced a massive influx of human capital during and following the Second World War, as thousands of talented immigrants from all across the world, from places like Europe, Japan, China, Korea, and India, came to the United States and contributed not only to the war effort, but also to the science and technology landscape in the post-war economy. Since then, the United States has benefited greatly from the intellectual capital of foreign-born scientists and researchers. This includes U.S. university research conducted by foreign students and scholars. A recent report commissioned by the National Science Foundation further noted that the United States must continue to attract and retain the best science talent globally if it wants to maintain its preeminence in science, engineering, and technology. Next slide, please. However, on the flip side, there is a risk that these foreign students and scholars may transfer or export potentially sensitive information back to their home countries. If such transfers include information about sensitive civilian or defense-related technologies, they could have significant consequences for US national security and the US economy. According to the FBI, the annual cost to the US economy of counterfeit goods, pirated software, and theft of trade secrets ranges from $225 to $600 billion. Although the majority of foreign students and scholars do not pose a threat to the United States, the FBI and others have found that some foreign actors seek to illicitly acquire US academic research to advance their home country's scientific, economic, and military development goals. By doing so, they can save their home countries significant time, money, and resources while achieving generational advances in technology. Over the past few years, as you're well aware, alarm bells have been ringing across the US government over concerns regarding foreign actors' targeting of national security information and proprietary technology from US research institutions. Various US government officials have warned that numerous foreign intelligence services, including China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea, seek to exploit the openness of American society, including academia and the scientific community. The graphic on this slide, developed by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, shows the breadth of China's strategic goals and the methods and tactics the Chinese government employs to accomplish these goals. The FBI and other agencies refer to foreign students and scholars working to illicitly obtain access to US research as non-traditional collectors. This is in contrast to what we think of as traditional covert intelligence gathering by spies. Next slide, please. So what's the scope of this issue in the United States? Let's add some numbers to the discussion. In 2018, there were more than 1.2 million foreign students studying at US universities. China and India accounted for more than 50% of these students. Almost 45% of these students pursued a STEM major, that's science, technology, engineering, and math. And then within this group of STEM majors, more than 70%, or about 400,000, were studying at the graduate level. According to FBI officials we interviewed, graduate students and visiting scholars pose a greater concern than undergraduate students because they often have the opportunity to gain knowledge that is difficult to acquire outside the United States and are more likely to have access to sensitive information and technologies. Next slide, please. Now let's turn to foreign scholars. In 2018, more than 21,000 foreign scholars worked at US universities. 10 countries accounted for about 70% of these scholars, China and India, again, accounting for more than 50% of those. Although, again, the majority of foreign students and scholars working at US universities do not pose a threat to the United States, FBI officials told us that it only takes a few universities conducting sensitive research with researchers who are intent on circumventing export control regulations to have a massive impact on the global balance of power. For example, officials cited the well-known case of A.Q. Khan, a scientist from Pakistan who studied nuclear energy abroad, albeit not in the United States, and then returned to Pakistan and used the knowledge he gained abroad to develop Pakistan's nuclear energy and weapons capabilities. He then allegedly shared some of this knowledge with other US adversaries, such as North Korea, Iran, and Libya. Next slide, please. So what steps has the US government taken to address this potential threat? Let's take the well-known example of China. FBI Director Christopher Wray recently gave remarks at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and stated that the Chinese government tries to entice scientists at US universities to bring their knowledge back to China, even if that means stealing proprietary information or violating export control laws to do so. In response to this threat, the Department of Justice launched the China Initiative in late 2018. Some of the goals of the initiative include, for example, developing an enforcement strategy concerning non-traditional collectors, again, researchers in labs, universities, and the defense industrial base, that are being co-opted into transferring technology contrary to US interests. And secondly, educating colleges and universities about potential threats to academic freedom and open discourse from influence efforts on campus. Next slide, please. Where do these efforts stand? Well, as of September 4th, the Department of Justice had arrested more than 20 individuals through the efforts of the China Initiative, including several Chinese and American university researchers. To take one prominent example, as shown here, Charles Lieber, a renowned Harvard chemistry professor, was arrested earlier this year by FBI agents who alleged that he set up a lab in China in exchange for hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments from the Chinese government, and then denied knowledge of those payments to US investigators and university administrators. Lieber is believed to have been a part of China's Thousand Talents program from at least 2012 through 2017. His contract through the program called for a salary as high as $50,000 a month, along with about $150,000 per year for living expenses and $1.5 million to establish a lab at the Wuhan University of Technology. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the issues confronting the United States. Before we discuss the key findings from our report, we still need to take a brief step back and talk about export controls and how they relate to research at US universities. I'll turn it over to Taylor for this discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Drew. So as he mentioned, we focused on just one aspect of economic espionage, which is the circumvention of export controls. But as Drew mentioned, it's useful to take a step back and go through some definitions, including what exactly are exports and export controls. So an export is an oral, written, electronic, or visual disclosure, shipment, transfer, or transmission of commodities, technology, information, technical data, assistance, or software source code to a foreign national, whether that foreign national is in the United States or abroad. As such, export controls regulate the shipment, transfer, or disclosure of controlled items such as technical data or software that is identified on certain specific control lists that are maintained by the US government. These export controls help to protect national security and the economic interests of the United States. So our report focused on US universities' efforts to stem the illicit transfer of deemed exports rather than tangible exports, such as biological agents or some of the other things that can be built or produced in a lab. So deemed exports take place when technology or source code is released to a foreign national within the United States or abroad. This release is considered to be an export or re-export to that person's home country. So as an example, a professor may be working with infrared camera technology, and they may transfer that technology to a Chinese national in the course of a research project by training that Chinese researcher how to build or use the export controlled technology. The action may be regulated as if the technology was shipped to China, and thus the transfer is deemed to be an export to China, even though all of the activities took place within the United States. Now, there are some university activities that are excluded from export control regulations, and the primary exclusion relates to fundamental research. Fundamental research is basic or applied research in science and engineering, the results of which are ordinarily published and shared broadly within the scientific community. This definition was established in 1985 by President Ronald Reagan, and in speaking with federal agency officials and university officials, we learned that a large majority of university research is considered fundamental and is therefore excluded from export control regulations. However, when universities use export controlled items in their research, they must comply with a complex set of export laws and regulations. In our report, we focused on the departments of State and Commerce who oversee and play major roles in the implementation of US export controls. So state regulates the export of sensitive military items known as defense articles and defense services, such as tanks, fighter aircrafts, missiles, and military training, which it lists on the United States Munitions List, or USML. Commerce, conversely, controls the export of US origin items with both commercial and military applications that they call dual-use items, such as computers, sensors and lasers, telecommunications equipment such as satellites, and you'll see drones and iPhones are on the slide as well, which it lists on the Commerce Control List, or CCL. So given those definitions and all of the information that we talked about, we wanted to discuss two sections of our recent report, which examined first the extent to which state and commerce have provided guidance and outreach that supports US universities' understanding of and compliance with export control regulations, and two, the extent to which export compliance policies and practices developed by US universities align with state and commerce's export compliance guidelines. So the first thing we wanted to understand is what agency guidance is available and how well this guidance support universities' compliance with export control regulations. To address this question, we interviewed state and commerce officials and reviewed their export compliance guidance and outreach to understand the materials that these agencies have developed. We then interviewed representatives from 9 universities and 4 university associations representing over 180 research universities about existing guidance to obtain their views regarding 1, its usefulness, and 2, its applicability. So here's what we found. We found that state and commerce have provided guidance and conducted outreach regarding export compliance policies. For example, both agencies have developed a set of export compliance guidelines that includes elements that each agency considers to be critical to building an effective export compliance program, such as training and record keeping, as well as additional guidance for how exporters can address each element in their export compliance program. We found that both agencies also provided training, they presented at conferences, and they conduct site visits to further educate university exporters. This includes attendance at some university-specific events, as well as site visits to universities. However, university and association officials that we interviewed expressed concerns that agency guidance and outreach did not adequately address university-specific concerns. For example, some universities told us that it's sometimes difficult to understand how to implement industry-focused guidance that's developed by state or commerce. According to these officials, industry typically differs from that of academia because industry is focused on the creation of proprietary technologies, whereas academia is primarily focused on expanding knowledge through research and collaboration. When we asked university and association officials how guidance could be improved, they told us that additional state and commerce guidance regarding issues of interest to universities, such as deemed exports and fundamental research, would be helpful to them. And a couple of university officials even suggested that agencies consider developing webinars or videos providing examples of export scenarios in a university environment. One, to clarify the intent of export control regulations, and then two, to explain how regulatory requirements pertain to university research. I'll turn it over to Amanda now to discuss universities' export compliance efforts.
Great, thank you, Taylor. So as Taylor mentioned, our requesters also wanted to know how U.S. universities are safeguarding sensitive technologies from unauthorized foreign access. To address this request, we decided to review selected universities' export compliance policies and practices against the Department of State's and the Department of Commerce's compliance guidelines. Now, although universities are not required to follow these guidelines, we believe that the guidelines serve as a set of best practices. So to conduct our analysis, next slide, please. To conduct our analysis, we first reviewed both sets of agency guidelines and identified common elements across them. We used this information to develop a list of 8 elements that are critical for an effective compliance program, such as management commitment and training. We included the list of our 8 elements on this slide with a brief description of each, and I apologize, they're pretty small. We then selected 9 universities for our analysis from a list of 292 research universities that expend, on average, more than $15 million on research and development annually. Now, other factors that influence the selection of universities in our analysis included the number of graduate students, the amount of research funding received from DoD, NASA, and other agencies, and regional diversity. We wanted a broad mix of universities in our selection. We then visited the 9 universities and interviewed officials about their export compliance policies and practices and assessed their responses against the 8 elements that we identified. Next slide, please. So as you can see from this figure, the 7 universities with the highest research expenditures have policies and practices that generally align with the 8 elements of an effective export compliance program, while the 2 universities with the lowest expenditures have more weaknesses with their compliance programs. Now, when looking at the individual elements, most of the universities we visited have robust practices in the following 4 areas: management commitment, export authorization, record keeping, and reporting violations. So let me provide you with a few examples of some of the practices that these universities have implemented to safeguard export controlled items. So with regards to management commitment, we found that management at most of the universities we visited issued public statements that emphasized the university's commitment to export compliance efforts. In addition, all but one of the universities had an export control officer on staff when we visited. The second element I would like to discuss is export authorization. So this is where the rubber really meets the road, because this element covers all the controls a university may have in place to identify and track research projects that utilize export controlled items. So let me walk through a few brief examples. All the universities we visited require a lead researcher to submit research proposals to an office that is charged with reviewing and submitting research proposals. Some of the universities developed flowcharts or checklists to help this office understand when to flag research proposals or awards for further review by the export control officer. For another example, officials at most of the universities said that they used technology control plans to safeguard export controlled items. Now, according to Commerce's guidelines, organizations that work with export controlled items and either employ or meet with foreign nationals should create technology control plans. These plans should include physical and information security plans, as well as training programs. 6 of the 9 universities we visited go even further and require that lead researchers sign the technology control plan in order to acknowledge that they understand their responsibilities for protecting the export controlled items identified in the plan. However, as you can also see from this figure, some of the universities we visited had weaknesses in their programs in 4 specific areas: risk assessments, training, internal audits, and having an export compliance manual. So for example, 4 of the universities did not conduct risk assessments, which may limit their ability to identify and address risks in their export compliance programs. In addition, 2 of the universities did not provide any formal training for researchers and other officials involved in implementing export control regulations, such as the officials who review research proposals. Although most universities have an export control officer to help guide researchers, it is ultimately the lead researcher who is responsible for managing a project and so properly safeguarding any export controlled items. As such, it's important that export control officers educate lead researchers and others about their roles and responsibilities. So that was just a snapshot of our work. If you're interested in a more detailed description of the various compliance practices that the selected universities have implemented, we have a very thorough discussion of this analysis in Appendix 3 of our report. So I'm going to move on to our recommendations. So based on the work that we conducted, we made 4 recommendations to federal agencies. Specifically, we recommended that the Departments of State and Commerce provide universities with additional or revise existing guidance and outreach to address university-specific export control issues to further support universities' understanding and compliance with the regulations. We further recommended that they take this action in consultation with university representatives. We made 2 other recommendations to the Departments of State and Defense for issues we didn't address in this presentation, but I'll just walk through them quickly. So for the Department of State, we also recommended that they revise the existing export compliance guidelines to include information regarding the need to conduct periodic risk assessments. Considering that several universities we visited did not conduct risk assessments, we thought it was especially important for state to include such information in their guidance to support exporters' efforts to develop effective export compliance programs. Conversely, the Commerce Department does include information about risk assessments in their guidelines. Finally, we recommended that the Department of Defense take steps to ensure that 1, program officers who write solicitations for research projects, and 2, contracting officers who write contracts to fund the research projects, both interpret export control requirements consistently to avoid confusion, contract delays, and other issues that may hinder DoD-funded research at universities. So before we close out our portion of the presentation, we also wanted to share some information about the current work our team is conducting, which Kim previously mentioned. So for the second phase, we are focusing more on the monitoring and enforcement of export controls, specifically again at US universities. We're looking at 3 specific issues. First, we're looking at the extent to which US agencies have identified and addressed potential risks associated with foreign students and scholars at US universities who may seek to evade US export control laws. Secondly, we're looking at the mechanisms that US agencies are using to monitor compliance with and enforce export control regulations at the universities, as well as how they are coordinating these efforts. And finally, we're looking at the challenges that US agencies face in monitoring compliance with and enforcing export control regulations at US universities. So that's it from the GAO right now. Thank you again for allowing us to present on our work. We look forward to discussing these issues with you further during the Q&A period. And so now I'll turn it over to Dr. Lee.
Wonderful. Welcome, Dr. Lee.
Well, thank you so much. I learned a lot. It's 11 p.m. in Seoul. I guess that you guys feel that I need to do some study, so having me stay awake, and it's a very something new that I learned. Several years ago, I was a visiting scholar at Stanford University, and I was making some copies. Copies from this textbook and that textbook, so that I was making a syllabi to teach students. And then suddenly I got a warning email from the university. Roughly speaking, it reads like this: you are making too many copies. Please save a paper. Scan the textbook and send it directly to your email account so that we can protect the environment. I was surprised. See, in the copy room, I was the only person, but somebody was definitely watching me. And now I know who is watching me now. So through this session, a very wonderful presentation, and I certainly feel that my American friends are certainly ahead of this game on this issue, and also taking this issue very seriously, duly, which I agree. And I could just, I think my role is to share the local perspective, how things are happening in South Korea. I'm just speaking from my personal capacity. And last year, that is 2019, the South Korean Ministry of Trade and Industry and Energy, for the first time, conducted a survey on the current state of key national technologies at major South Korean universities nationwide, and the status of foreign students studying in their departments. As I said, this was the first time the South Korean government conducted such a survey related to technology leaks from the universities. The survey was based on the information that Chinese IT companies were exploiting Korean universities' industry university cooperation program to steal technology. The background is that the Korean government has stepped up its crackdown on technology theft, and the Korean industry sector has also ramped up its vigilance against talent leaks, and the Chinese IT companies are attempting to approach instead Korean universities, because academic institutions by nature tend to have weak security. So in one case, Chinese IT company employee, he came to South Korea as a graduate student, and he participated in one of these programs and stole the technology, which was reported by South Korean media. Actually, most of what I'm sharing today is you could do some, if you know the Korean language, is public information. And this, the IT technology theft just happened in Pangyo. Pangyo area is where it's the South Korea Silicon Valley. This is where, not far from where I'm sitting right now, is my institution is also located in Pangyo. And just 3 months ago, a former Samsung executive, who worked for Samsung for 40 years and retired, and he was hired by a Chinese company. But then there was an eruption of a public uproar that, aware of this possible, intellectual brain leak, that, facing the public protest, he gave up, even though it is not illegal for him to do so because of the sensitivity involved and his own experience. And it just happens to be that just this month, a professor at KAIST KAIST is Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. KAIST is South Korea's MIT. A professor is an expert in self-driving car. His particular expertise in the self-driving car's radar. And it was discovered by the university committee that for the last 3 years, he was receiving money from a Chinese university and handing over his technology, his know-how, his data. And later it was discovered, and that they're still investigating. When he was approached by China's 1,000 Talents Plan. So if this case is confirmed, this professor could be the first case, confirmed case in South Korean case of a Korean participant in the 1,000 Talents Plan, which most of us Korean public are not aware of actually. So that's why I'm saying that South Korean government is overall, the South Korea is a neighbor to China. We have 43% of foreign students are Chinese students. The two countries very robust exchange culture, including cultural educational programs, so that that's why for the first time last year the government thought that this issue is something serious that they need to take a look. But then the situation is that most Korean universities, they found that do not have a separate guidelines on how to deal with such issues like that. And they don't have any university officials or department task force team that monitor such an issue. And the South Korea, when it comes to government agencies, South Korea doesn't have what the US has. That is that South Korea does not have the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, I think that's how you call it. However, South Korea is also beginning to take this issue seriously. And according to 2018 government estimate, for the last 6 years up to 2018, there were 166 cases of university education facility intellectual theft was discovered. And more than half of all of that, to be precise, that is 57%, was done by Chinese nationals. And among them, 12 cases touches upon South Korea's national core technology. The way the government defines national core technologies, that is a technology that have a significant negative impact on the nation's security and the national economy. To be more specific, the theft technologies involved in shipbuilding technology, high value added ship design. As some of you know, South Korea is the #1 country in the world when it comes to shipbuilding. And LNG shipbuilding technology, OLED, liquid crystal technology, that is used for television screens, mobile phone screens, and electronic car batteries. And the recent trend is that the way the theft was done is that they also using not just the illegal way, but also legitimate means. That is that some Chinese companies, they have a legally acquire Korean companies. For example, Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, SAIC, purchased a controlling stake of South Korea's most famous SUV maker, SsangYong, in 2004. And the Chinese reportedly has access to the Mercedes-Benz licensed technology SsangYong was using at the time. To be fair to the Chinese side, the Chinese company denies that. So when it comes to the government side, it was the nation's security apparatus, National Intelligence Service, that noticed the increasing traffic of industrial and technology theft, as well as the brain drain and how that could affect South Korea's development for the midterm and long term. So NIS established a task force team to deal with the issue called the National Industrial Security Center, NISC. Also later, another government organization, police, also set up in 2010 its own bureau, task force team, to specifically deal with the matter. The second is roughly translated as Industrial Technology Leak Investigation Task Force Team. In Korean, we call it 산업기술유출수사대. So these are the two main security agencies in South Korea that pay attention to the matter. Plus, as I mentioned at the outset of my talk, the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy is also looking at for the first time beginning from last year. So I think having said that, I think it's important that university by nature is proud of being openness, open discussions, intellectual discussions, teamwork. So I'm not here to scapegoat a particular country. But then I think it's also important that the issue is being paid attention to, and the South Korea is not exception. Even China is, is also growing very intellectually high power when it comes to sophisticated technology. So China also is important for South Korea, China to secure its technology as well. That means that it's beneficial that US and South Korea and like-minded other countries, and even including China, we perhaps could cooperate, talk more, and establish common guidelines and boundaries, and also letting visiting scholars and exchange students and foreign students know that at the admission period, that these are the things that you need to keep in mind, that you should do your research within this boundary. That applies to Koreans, that applies to Japanese, that applies to Chinese, and even when American students come to South Korea universities, cooperate with us, and that applies to American students as well. So maybe it's a helpful beginning step for us to talk and discuss, share ideas and brainstorm more. I think this is a start. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. That was also, as with our GAO colleagues, terrific input from you and a perspective from Korea, because as I said at the outset, as an organization working on US-Asia relations, we are always looking for avenues where common issues are shared between the United States and Asia, and where we might collaborate, especially and primarily with our allies and partners such as Korea. And as you are well aware, there are efforts going on to coordinate amongst both G7 as well as US allies and partners in Asia on these issues of economic statecraft. So I thank you all for your terrific presentations. I'm going to make a couple remarks before turning to the Q&A, because we have a couple of questions there as well. I had a general question for our GAO colleagues, and since I am not in a reporting chain or command to task anything, but I was just thinking, what studies would I like to see next? And I thought, one thing is, how does the university sector on research, first of all, what is its scale relative to our national labs? And being myself a previous and current employee of FFRDCs, federally funded research and development centers, I was also curious, just what is the scale of the university export controlled work versus the work done at our national labs, whether that be Livermore or Scandia or whatever the different ones are, as well as at FFRDCs. In other words, do you see a distinction in the regulatory guidelines? At no point did you say as part of the DOC and DOS, for example, I imagine certain contracts that are being fulfilled at university research labs required cleared employees, require special facilities that are completely separate from access to. So that was kind of one question, is where does the university environment now sit? The second is, what is the economic balance here? What are the implications really as we talk about decoupling from the main potential adversary? Of not having, as Drew Lindsay started from the beginning, what are the benefits of having foreign students, including in the STEM fields rather, of work? how can you come to an economic analysis, net analysis of cost benefits of restrictions? Or is it just better to say, we're just going to move this work out of, I mean, I'm sure I'll get university letters and comments, but move it out of universities and keep it only in our national labs in order to get free flow of foreign students. I mean, that's a way of decoupling, right? You just don't allow that stuff to be done in porous places. You put it in places which are non-porous, that can have 50, 60, 70, 80 years of controlled access, controlled employees, etc. I mean, one could think that way, right? So those are my two big sort of meta questions on the nature of organizations that should and do this and where universities fit, and the economic analysis. And a very specific question for Ms. Bright. I was quite intrigued, and maybe I misunderstood or misheard, the notion that US military exercise with foreign powers require export clearances. And I'm sure that those are built into the state of play with our treaty allied partners. But I was just curious. I'd never heard that, never thought about it. And I was just intrigued by it. So maybe you could answer that specific question. And for Dr. Lee, just to end with one question. I've often wondered in the Korean case, of course, national security, Sang-han, but in the Korean case, particularly on those core industries, one might make the case that the driver in ROK's approach is a little bit different from our civil military fusion commentary in the US, which is really national security, adversarial tactics, versus Korea's, which is heavily competition based. So the core technology on liquid crystal technology for screens really speaks to South Korea's comparative advantage in producing that technology, or shipbuilding. So is it competition driven, or is it defense industrial base, national security driven, which seems to be the primary motivation in our country? So thank you. Let me put those questions to you, and we'll collect a few more in our Q&A. I invite my GAO colleagues to open first, and then Dr. Lee can answer the question.
Sure. I can speak a little bit about the FFRDCs, but unfortunately we did not look at the national labs at all. They fell outside the scope of our review. We did speak with the agencies pretty thoroughly about the FFRDCs and how that contracting process works, and also with some of the universities that we visited. We were able to visit a few FFRDCs as well as UARCs, the University Affiliated Research Centers as well. We did end up excluding them from the scope of our review because we decided to focus more on the main university campuses, because as you alluded to, an FFRDC does have many, many years and especially physical security policies and practices in place. A lot of times they are located off of a university campus. And so that is one way in which they can kind of put up a roadblock and not allow any unauthorized foreign access into the building. So we decided that that was a little outside the scope. We really wanted to focus on what was happening on the main university campuses. Now, with regards to the economic implications, or, some of the universities we did talk to mentioned that they have these FFRDCs specifically so that they focus on fundamental research on the main campus. And if any of their researchers want to work on export controlled work or classified work, they ship those off to the FFRDCs. But again, we didn't really focus on that in our report. With regards to economic implications, I don't think we can really speak to that. It was outside the scope of our review, but I'll let Drew or Kim jump in if they would like to discuss any of that.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. It certainly was outside the scope of our review for this time, but one of the things that we heard over and over again was the blurred line around what is fundamental research. There's a lot of discussion out there regarding the definition of fundamental research and how that's applied on a university campus, and the expectation of folks working on a university campus as opposed to an FFRDC or even a military base, that there's an expectation that, in some cases there's a requirement to publish research work. There's just an open flow of information on a university campus, which is not an expectation in these other environments. So while we didn't come out with any findings in this regard, we certainly understood that there is some difficulty in establishing the border around what is fundamental research and what isn't fundamental research. And in our follow-on work, which we're just getting started on now, we are talking to universities, but we're also talking to the agencies to determine how they're working with the universities and identifying the challenges in enforcing these export control regulations. And I know that fundamental research is going to be part of that story as well.
Drew, did you have anything further on this?
I would just make one additional broader point to your question, and that's that there's the issue of fundamental research. There also is just the overarching challenge with the export control regimes of keeping up with new advances. So commerce and state, these are primarily list-based regimes. So for something to be controlled, it needs to be included on the list. And a lot of the technologies that are of concern now are emerging and foundational technologies that may not even be included on either commerce or state's list. And so I think that the challenge going beyond just foundational research is making sure that some of these key emerging technologies are included on lists. And there is an effort underway now in response to the Export Control Reform Act from 2018 for Commerce to lead a process, an interagency process, to identify some of these emerging and foundational technologies that are seen as being critical to the national security of the United States. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, they announced an advance notice of proposed rulemaking where they're accepting public comments on some preliminary thoughts about how to go about putting together this list. So it's a painstaking effort because, of course, it has to take into consideration the balance that you spoke of. What are the benefits of having foreign students and scholars and all the benefits associated with that, but also protecting some of the key technologies that could lead to generational advances in an economy and military capabilities.
I'm really glad you raised those issues because they really are. And Kim also raised this issue of, what is fundamental and dual use? In the technology field, people do discuss this. And not only that, what should be on a munitions list at state or a Department of Commerce restricted list? Having in a previous life worked the DOE Part 810 CFR regulations on export controls, I can tell you that looking at export controls and deciding whether a particular sale or an export made sense, these are when they're clear cut, they're clear cut, but that's not where the difficulty is. Sometimes which steam turbine engine, depending on end user license agreement, is okay and one is not. It's not black and white. Otherwise, there'd be no debate. We wouldn't be having this discussion. So thank you so much for that. That was really terrific. Taylor, do you want to take a stab at the military exercises before we turn to Dr. Lee on the framing of the Korean approach to this?
Yeah, of course. I can only speak to what I know from ITAR guidance that when the US provides military training, it's considered providing a defense service. So that's furnishing assistance to foreign persons, whether that's in the US or abroad, in things such as design, development, engineering, manufacture, production, assembly, testing, repair, maintenance of these defense articles, as well as giving them any technical data that's controlled, in addition to the training of their units and forces, formal or informal, in the US or abroad. So there are various mechanisms. We have, military officers that come to study in the United States. We do the same, whereas our military officers go and study abroad as well. So yeah, it's interesting that training is controlled under ITAR, but it is.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. I had just never really thought about that element of the exchange of a service defense article in terms of military exercise. It's just not something I put together. Dr. Lee, would you be so kind as to maybe take an issue of what's the balance between in Korea on the competition to industries versus national security and particularly since ROK is an ally of the United States, what kind of implications might be? I know there's been a lot of discussion of the Huawei issue.
Well, thank you, Sato. You raised a really interesting question. I'll make my comments really short. I'm probably lying. Whether it's competition-driven or defense security-driven, I think there is some cultural aspect in South Korea. As you know, South Korea is confronted with North Korea. This is the last remaining Cold War bloc in the world. So that there is a huge historical trauma in a sense that for South Koreans, as a country, we just began the democracy transition from 1987. So it's a 30 something years, a very young democracy. But then we have a huge historical baggage of Cold War trauma, ideological division. So that people, just this kind of security concerns, we have some culture that we don't talk about it. Of course, security apparatus, they look at, but then as a public discourse, scholars, academics, there is some culture that we tend to not to talk about it because there is a trauma, and there are some in history, some liberal scholars, liberal politicians, and the government accused them as a communist sympathizers, and we put them in the prison. So if you talk about this 007 like intellectual chapter was 20 spies, and some people might accuse you like you still have that Cold War mentality. We are living in post-Cold War era. We are the world. We have lived together. Why you still have this Cold War mentality, looking at your friends and other countries from this peculiar angle? From the Cold War, looking at as a possible adversary, you should look at it from more like open-minded. So there's this particular cultural embeddedness that, but then I think due to a series of events that I just mentioned, the intellectual theft and even universities and Samsung and Huawei, even which I can talk about it later for hours and hours. I've been to Huawei facilities in China headquarters and also R&D center in Beijing. But I think overall for this issue, South Korea is as a public, as a discourse, we are just waking up. We are just getting started. We are beginning to take this seriously.
That's a very interesting element, the cultural one. I hadn't been so aware of that, that it also feeds into this larger narrative in Korea. We heard from Korean colleagues just earlier this week that Korean industry is now looking at a 3 to 5 year technology life cycle in investments in China before their technology is compromised. So, it's kind of an interesting development and change over time. So thank you for that. Let me now turn to the Q&A section. We have a question from Michael Anderson for the GAO. This is for the GAO reps in particular. How would you summarize both the US government agencies, state and commerce, and US universities' overall export compliance or lack thereof? In short, Michael is asking for a net assessment. Is it a big problem or not? Your 6 to 9, your nine case studies and your findings, can you elaborate? Are we doing good, well, or we need to do a lot better? Where are we?
I think that's going to be a difficult question to answer. Our second part of the work that we're starting is looking at the agencies themselves and some of the challenges that they're facing. I also wonder if some of the response to this question would be information we wouldn't be able to share publicly because the agencies themselves are concerned about release of that type of information. So we'd be under the same sort of restrictions that they would be. As far as the universities are concerned, as was mentioned, we only really looked at 9 in particular. I mean, we chose them very carefully because of the level of their research dollars and their relationship with the US government and their need to follow export control regulations. So it's difficult to look across. As we noted, we picked them out of almost 300 different universities that we could have chosen. So it's hard to say. I mean, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, you hear about some of the big stories in the news about, large disclosures of information or what have you, but I think it's something interesting to look into as far as not just the big universities that have tens of millions of dollars of research, but also the smaller universities that have partnerships with the U.S. government, and to what extent, is there leakage there? And that's, I think that would be something a little bit beyond our ability to do in one report. But certainly it's a really good question. And, it's something I think, as Drew mentioned, because technology is changing so quickly and the lists are not being updated as quickly as perhaps they could be, it's something the U.S. government is working on very hard, but it's like any illicit activity. It always seems like the folks who are engaged in that illicit activity are half a step ahead, and we're always playing catch up. But Drew, if you have any other thoughts about that, I'd welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, no, the only point I would add is that, and I think this is self-evident, is that, state and commerce, they are responsible for implementing export controls. There's a whole legal and regulatory framework that sets up this compliance regime. But ultimately, and I think GAO, we've done some past work on this, it's been over 10 years, but we're on record as having also said that primarily it's up to industry and universities to voluntarily comply with these regulations and with these laws. And like a lot of different compliance regimes, the US government has some ability, although probably not as much as people might imagine or would like, to monitor and enforce these laws and regulations. And so that's part of the issue that we will be going into, I think, a deeper treatment in the next report. So stay tuned for that one in 2021.
Well, thank you so much. It must be tough to keep on top of what's the next technology that needs to be controlled, given the speed at which things happen. It's sort of like keeping up with phone scammers. You develop a way to block, and then there's another way they get in. I mean, I just, I don't, you're constantly playing this this game. One other question, and we only have a couple minutes, and I will end with Dr. Lee. A question kind of directed to Dr. Lee is, how, given what you've heard and what you were at Stanford, you've been in the US for years, somehow, what's the kind of fundamental difference you would say between China-South Korea collaboration and academic collaboration and industrial collaboration versus the US? Obviously, the numbers are not so big. You've spoken about hiring South Korean engineers to Harbin Institute of Technology and other known entities in China. But what are some other differences that you would flag in consideration of this issue that puts ROK China versus, the US-China relationship on this front?
Well, this is a little bit broad question. But then let me put it, I'm not sure whether I'm answering the question directly, but let me put it this way. South Korea is one of the allies of the United States, and I expect that Washington will communicate this discovery and the importance of it, and duly communicate with Seoul, Tokyo, Canberra, Singapore, other allies and like-minded friends. And in terms of approaching and communicating with them, I think one important thing is to keep in mind that where they are coming from, just the cultural aspect that I just mentioned. That there might be some resistance from South Korean side, not because they don't want to cooperate, but because it's a historical trauma. Cold War baggage that we don't want to look at the world from this Cold War mentality, and there is huge sociological resistance that we don't want to exclude a particular country. There's some tendency that that's not the right thing to do, while it is becoming also at the same a very serious, real issue as well. So as allies and among like-minded countries, when we communicate and sit down together, and this common important issue, those kind of cultural settings and understanding where this person or this country coming from, I think is also important in our discussion and more to have a more effective communication. When it comes to the difference between Chinese communication with China, communication with I'll think about it and come back to you if I have some better answers.
Welcome that, Dr. Lee, and I think that competitive element is going to be really important in making a narrative in the Korean case. Listen, what a terrific presentation from all of you. I'm deeply grateful for you taking the time from so many locations, for Dr. Lee for staying up so late in Korea. I really thank you. It's, my goodness, it's close to midnight, past midnight, and it's certainly way past my ever bedtime. 2 advertisements before a formal thanks. September 30th, we have a wonderful assortment of experts from throughout Philippines, Indonesia, US, Vietnam, countries looking at science diplomacy on the South China Sea. We have lots of programs and understanding of the issues related to the military and security elements. We want to look at science diplomacy, coral reef protection, fishing rights, biodiversity, etc. So please join us September 30th, 10 a.m. October 23rd, not quite specifically related to this work of our discussion today, but a new book on Japan's geoeconomic strategy in Asia. Really important now as we look at these supply chains, changing regional trade agreements, the fundamental structural changes that are going on secular trends, on FDI trade, etc. So we'll be looking at that and many other programs to follow. So let me just thank all our participants for joining us both on YouTube and Zoom. And to GAO, really, this is emerging as a really wonderful avenue from my perspective at the East-West Center of cooperation and collaboration on your wonderful studies that implicate or relate in some way to US-Asia relations. And though that's not the subject per se of your study, it clearly relates. And I'm so grateful for your leadership and for all of you in your work to share that with us, because I think it brings an added dimension to the understanding of US-Asia relations as well. And Dr. Lee, of course, thank you. So good day to everyone. Please be healthy, be happy, be safe. And we look forward to seeing you for future programming at the East-West Center. If you're not on our email or newsletter list, please consider signing up. And good day. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.